You're gonna love this. GDP, inflation, unemployment, and a bunch of cool concepts. This is a common notion which kind of sounds logical first when you read it, but if you think about it more, you can think of some counter arguments and examples to it. So this is a good challenge for yourself. Pause here, think about some loopholes to this kind of notion. Write it down before you proceed. The GDP is at the core of macroeconomics. It is our yardstick for evaluating countries and policies. It's almost like the god of macroeconomics. It's super important. Now, what it is basically the value of everything produced in a country in a year, and it's measured in dollars. All right. So when you see gross, what is that? Does that mean disgusting, like this cartoon? No, gross means total, everything. Domestic means Canadian, and product means production. All right. So in French, you might have heard of this before. It's PEB. And this is where you can see what gross means. Gross means brute. Basically, it means before deductions. It's not even all. It just means before deductions. All right. It's a crude value. All right. It is the same as national income. This is another term. You might want to highlight these terms, by the way. And the symbol for it is Y. I know this is not smart. It's counterintuitive, maybe because I was taken for interest rate or investment. And it excludes inputs and intermediate goods. Why? Because the value of these things are already included in final products. It also excludes used products because the value of them were included in the previous years, right? So you want to avoid double counting, which is another important term. So for instance, think of a car. A car has steel in it, but we don't add the value of steel to GDP because the car's value already includes the value of the steel. So we only look at the final products which are sold to end consumers. Another term here is growth. So economic growth is the trend of GDP over the long run, all right? Not the short-term fluctuations from one year to another, but let's say over 15, 20 years, all right? And basically the way you measure GDP is by adding up everyone's expenditure, and that's called aggregate expenditure. So this is another term you might want to highlight, aggregate expenditure. Aggregate means total, so make sure you mark this. Aggregate means total, expenditure means spending. You're going to see this term a lot in economics. It simply means total spending, the spending of everyone on the final goods and services produced in Canada. Pause here and take some notes, include the little symbols and terminology. We measure GDP by counting up all spending on final Canadian goods and services. All right, so let's have a sector and expenditure table. Let's start simple. Whatever you buy as a student, as a family, is called household spending. And the name for that is consumption. All right, so that's everything that Canadian households buy. But firms also buy goods and services for their business, and that's called investment. Now, heads up here, watch out guys. In economics, when you say investment, economic investment is different from financial investment. Economic investment is always by firms. It's always by firms, not by households. Whatever you do, let's say you save your money, in everyday language we call it investment, but in economics we don't call that investment. That's called saving. In economics, investment is only by firms, not by individual households. All right. The government also spends money on roads, schools, army, healthcare, right? So that's called government purchases. Is there anyone else who spends money on our goods and services? Well, what about foreigners? Yeah. What is it called when other countries buy from us? That's called Canadian exports. So whatever we sell to others is called exports. The symbol for that is X. Like what? Now, I love it here. Whenever I ask students what is Canadian export, they're like, maple syrup. Come on, guys, get serious. You don't run an economy with that. Don't we have anything better to show for? No, we produce a lot of things. We export a lot of things like airplanes, car parts, electricity, water, and tourism. All right. So that would be a good table for how we measure GDP. Do one for yourself, and also do some drawings so that you maintain it better. So for government, you can try to do a maple leaf. This is a fun slide. Sometimes my students are like, sir, you have a very weird definition of fun. No, but you're gonna like this. So let's put everything together. We have a formula for GDP, which is the same as aggregate expenditure, putting all of the different forms of spending. But hang on, this is an overestimation. Think of your consumption. Whatever you buy, is it made in Canada? Remember that GDP, the D stands for domestic, so it should be things that are produced in Canada. But a lot of the things that you buy are made in China or the US, or if you buy coffee, it's made in Colombia or Costa Rica. So we have to subtract imports, all right? And then we get our formula for GDP, all right? So we subtract imports so that we are not double counting. And this is a super useful formula, so write it down and highlight it or box it. And we're going to unpack it and see what each part of it includes. So we're going to start with consumption, which is whatever households buy, and we classify it based on a number of categories. So one of them is durable goods. So you can think of some examples for that. Another one would be semi-durable goods. Again, you can think of some examples for that. Now, look at cars. There are some types of cars which are semi-durable. Yeah, like American cars. Yeah, there you go. And then there are non-durable goods. All right. You may also add BlackBerry cell phone. No, what have I done? All right. And also a fourth category, which is actually the most important, is services. All right, because most of our consumption is actually on services. It's not tangible, but still has value and is part of our GDP. Okay. Now, one part that I want to emphasize here when it comes to questions that you do is durable goods. So what is special about durable goods is that they're often purchased on credit, on a loan, which means that you must pay interest on it. So you're like, oh no, interest. All right, and it includes some long-term planning. So there's an element of long-term stability in it. Okay, so pause here, do some summary, make sure you have your formula, and also write an example of your own for each of these four categories. Did you see that? It shattered. The next item in our formula is investment, which is by firms, and it has some common features with durable goods. So something that's kind of important in terms of investment is that it's always a form of borrowing, and it's directly affected by the interest rate as a disincentive, all right? So you might get questions like this: if the interest rate goes up, the level of borrowing goes down. Basically, the firms will be unable to borrow as much loans to invest in their business, all right? We have the government. Whenever the government spends on some good or service, that would be part of GDP, but it does not include transfer payments. All right, so heads up here, guys. There are two types of spending that the government has. Sometimes the government spends money on goods and services. That's included in GDP. Sometimes the government spends money in forms of free assistance, like these things. These are not included in GDP because what? Remember, the P in GDP is for product, so it's only for production. But if the government is giving money not in exchange for good or service, then that's not a value added. It would not be part of our gross domestic product. All right. So you can, oh, that's so cool. Transfer payments are the same as a negative tax. It's the opposite of a tax. So we can have a picture here. We have the government on one side and we have the private sector. So the private sector includes households and firms. And both of them pay taxes to the government. So there are households and corporates, they have taxes. And both of them, or some of them at least, receive transfer payments. So some households and some firms also transfer some subsidies and bursaries and welfare and so forth. All right. So that's a dynamic that goes on between the government and others. So pause here, write down your notes. Try to write some examples for yourself for investment, like plants, a warehouse, trucks. Write your own example, and also for government purchases, some examples of things that are included in GDP like this, and some examples that are not included in GDP. Exports are things produced in Canada bought by foreigners, like your good old maple syrup. Yeah, good luck with that. And you can have some real examples of that, and imports would be the opposite of that. So these are things that we buy from others and we have to subtract from GDP in order to adjust. By the way, there can be some overlap between them, like oil and cars. These can be both imports and exports depending on the region and type. Consider tourism and cell phones. These are services. These are not goods, but services. They're intangible. And that's kind of important. It's a very common mistake that students think that exports and imports have to be physically shipped out. Not necessarily. Actually, most of our exports and imports are services. All right. As long as we are spending on foreign goods and services, that's an import. As long as they are spending on our goods and services, that's an export. All right. Another concept is net exports, which is the same as our trade balance. So these are the last two items in our aggregate expenditure formula, export minus import. So if our exports are more than our imports, that's called the trade surplus. If it's the other way around, it's called the trade deficit. All right. Now, the term deficit here may imply that that's negative, that it's something bad, but watch out because that's a fallacy of mercantilism. Imports are not bad. They are a smart way of saving on costs. So pause here, take notes, and write your own examples. Now you might be like, hang on, what about GNP? What is the difference between GDP and GNP? All right, so the difference really is geographical. In GDP, what matters is the income is generated in Canada. All right, so the emphasis is on domestic production. In GNP, the emphasis is that the income is received by Canadians, right? So you also have the French terms that some of you may have heard of it, right? So if the production takes place in Canada, that's GDP. The determining factor in GDP is where is the production? If it's in Canada, that's enough. That's enough to be GDP. In GNP, the yardstick, the criterion is where is the owner? If the owner is in Canada, then that's GNP. All right, so in other words, in terms of GDP, it's about the beginning of the production. If the beginning of the production is taking place in Canada, that's good enough for GDP. GNP looks at the end. Where does the income go? If the income leaves Canada, then that's not our GNP. All right, if some income comes to Canada, then that is part of our GNP. All right, so it's kind of like beginning and end. By the way, it's not a matter of citizenship either. It's more about the geography. All right, so we can have a nice Venn diagram. And by the way, most of the production is in the middle. So it's both GDP and GNP. But we're going to also look at some examples where it's only GDP or only GNP. So consider this, a hotel in Mexico owned by a Canadian firm. So the owner is Canadian, but the hotel is in Mexico. So that would be part of our GNP, but not part of our GDP. Okay. Now consider a Dodge plant in Ontario. Dodge is an American company, assuming that it still exists, right? But the production is taking place in Canada, right? So that would be part of our GDP, but not part of our GNP, okay? And once again, most of the things are in the middle, in the overlap. Now you might be like, hang on, which one is better? And it really depends. If you're looking for how easy it is to find a job in Canada, how much factories are working and producing, or the level of building and construction, then GDP would be better, all right? Whereas if you're looking for how much income is available to Canadian residents, then GNP would be better. In Canada, the GDP is a little bit higher than GNP because the foreign investment in Canada is higher than Canadian investment abroad. We care about GDP because it's used to find the standard of living, which is really the level of material comfort, all right? Now here's a question for you. Compare China versus Canada. Which one has a higher GDP? It's China. They have actually the second highest GDP in the world after the US. Now here's a question. Which country has a higher standard of living? Is it China? No, it's Canada. Now you might be like, hang on, how come they have more GDP but lower standard of living? And the answer is simple, because of the difference in population. They have a lot more population to divide and distribute that GDP among them, right? So we measure GDP per capita, all right, which is cap means head. So it's simply GDP over population. This is our measure for standard of living, all right? So what really matters isn't GDP itself. What matters more is GDP per capita, okay? So that's a useful formula, and it's really useful because it allows us to compare between different countries and have meaningful comparison instead of having, apples and oranges, okay? So higher GDP per capita means better, easier, and more convenient life. The labor force, also called the workforce, includes people who meet 4 conditions. And among these, I would emphasize the third one. Okay, so people who actually want to have a job. If somebody doesn't have a job, but they're okay with it, they're happy with it, then they're not part of the labor force, right? So here we have something called discouraged workers. You can guess what that means. These are people who wanted to have a job and they were looking for it, but after some time they gave up. So they're not part of labor force. They're not part of labor force because they're no longer looking for a job. There is a simple formula for labor force. It's the number of people employed plus the number of people unemployed, okay? So you write that down and highlight it. The gist of labor force is basically this condition of willing. Labor force are people who are willing to work. And that includes 2 categories. Some of them are willing and successful. Basically, they find a job. So employed are part of the labor force that actually have a job. And the other part are people who are willing to work, but they're unsuccessful, that they couldn't find a job. So in a sense, you could say that the employed are happy. Now, as a person, they might be depressed, but they're happy in the sense that they found a job. And unemployed are people are unhappy because they have the willingness, but they couldn't satisfy that. All right, again, as a person, they might be happy, but so to simplify it, you can say to make it easier to remember that employed are happy and unemployed are unhappy. So pause here and take notes. Let's look at some formulas which help you do problems. We have the employment rate and the unemployment rate. Employment rate is the number of people unemployed over the labor force times 100. Employment rate is the same thing but with the number of people employed. In some sources, they use the working population as the denominator in the employment rate formula, but we're going to keep it like this. Both versions are common, but we're going to use this one in this course, just so that you know that if in some sources you see employment rate having a different formulation, is possible. Depends on definition. All right, so what's going on? If you put these together, you would get 100%, which is 1. By the way, you should be comfortable converting percentages to decimals and vice versa. Okay? So these two are equivalent. Another formula is the adult population, which is labor force plus the people outside labor force. And from that, we get another formula, which is really useful. It's the labor force participation rate, which is the labor force over the adult population times 100. And the essence of labor force, again, is people who are willing to work. The essence of adult population is people who are able to work. So let me clarify here. What we say here, adult population, it does not include the elderly nor disabled people, even though they're adult. So I'm just simplifying it a bit. It's not really adult population, literally speaking, but people who are able to work. Okay? So you can think of labor force participation rate as the rate of laziness. So let me explain to you. If you have a 100% labor force participation rate, it means that all of your people who are able to work are also willing to work. So nobody's lazy, right? All of the capable people are also willing. So it means a rate of motivation. You could think of it like that, or a rate of laziness. Okay. For the same reason, unemployment rate is the rate of failure. Failure in the sense that those people who are willing to work, to what extent could they not find a job? All right. So how much could our society provide a job to those who are willing to work? And the employment rate would be the rate of success. So to what extent were they successful in finding a job? So pause here and write down your formulas with some interpretation of what each formula designates. Wow, that was cool. Let's look at a diagram and dissect it. First of all, we have the white region here, which are people who are either missing the age condition or the ability condition. All right. Then the blue region are people who are adults who are able to work, but they're not looking. All right, so they're not in the labor force. Your labor force will include the green area and the yellow area. Okay, so this is a good diagram to kind of visualize the different segments of labor force, adult population, and so forth. Let's look at a calculation question where that was cool. You're given a bunch of information about a city and you're supposed to find two values about this city. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do questions like this, and this would be a good frame of reference for you. So you start by writing the formulas that you need. In this case, you have the labor force participation rate. Now, the thing is, you do know the labor force, all right? That's great, but you don't know the adult population. You're like, oh no, what have I done? All right, no problem, because we have another formula which enables us to find the adult population. And here we do know both parts in this formula, the labor force as well as the people outside labor force. So what you do is you look at your numbers and you just plug them into this formula. Okay, so you're going to find the value yourself. I'm going to let you guys figure that out. Once you have that, then you can go back to your original formula and plug it in to get your labor force participation rate. Okay, notice that there is a percentage sign here because we are multiplying this by 100. So do that and keep at least 2 decimal places. I would say as a rule of thumb, have no less than 2 decimal places. More would be fine. And at the end, write a sentence. So put it into words that the labor force participation rate in this city is whatever. And we're going to do part B after. For the second part of the question, we're going to use the unemployment rate formula where we know the labor force, but we don't know the number of people unemployed. So we're like, oh no, what have I done? But we have another formula where we know the labor force and we know the people employed, so we should be able to find the number of people unemployed. Okay. Now, do you remember what happens when you move something over to the other side of an equation? It becomes negative, right? So from that, what we can do is we have the numbers that we need. and the number of people unemployed will be the labor force minus the people employed. Okay, so you just have to subtract. So plug those numbers in and see what you get. That would be the number of people unemployed. Then you plug it back into your original formula to find your unemployment rate. And it's going to be in percentage again, and that's your final answer. All right, this is not hard math. This is not rocket science, guys. At most, you're just moving things over or cross multiplying. All right, but if it's difficult for you, what I would suggest you to do is look at these numbers, create your own version. Like do another version with different numbers, and then solve. Just go through the steps that I showed you and do your own. But other than doing the numbers, I also want you to understand and interpret them properly. So we're going to have an interpretation. Oh, that's so cool. An interpretation sentence for each part. So many percent of the adults in this city are willing to have a job, and out of them, so many percent are not successful in finding a job. All right, so take notes. Did you see that? It was crushed. There are two main evils in macroeconomics. One of them is unemployment that we just saw. The other one is inflation. And this is basically when the cost of living goes up, and we measure it by comparing the cost of items that are most purchased by households. And this was developed by American economist Irving Fisher. It has a simple formula, which is the same as the percent change formula or the growth rate that you've seen before. Notice that these two means the second year compared to the first year, right? So the final value compared to the initial value, all right? And the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, sometimes in terms of notation, we just put P instead of it. So it's called the price level. If you see P instead, it's the same thing, right? So sometimes you see this version of the formula, it's the same thing, all right? Now, what is this CPI 1? This is the base year, okay? So base year is our frame of reference, and you're gonna see that again. And basically, whenever you have an index value like CPI, the base year value is going to be 100 because that's kind of like where we start, and everything else is compared to that. So pause here and write down your notes and formulas. The reason why we don't like inflation partly is because it affects our purchasing power. And you've seen this before. Do you remember what it means? It's basically how much goods and services you can buy. And it's really the value of your money, okay, the real value of it. So when the price goes up, what happens to your purchasing power? Your money will have less buying power, right? What happens to the value of savings? Let's say you have saved up $100. What's going to happen to your purchasing power with those $100 when prices go up? You can buy fewer things, so the value of your savings go down. And what about the people who have fixed income? Let's say people on fixed pensions that are not indexed to inflation. Well, they're going to be upset because they're getting the same dollar value, but their dollar is not worth as much as before. All right, so that's one reason why inflation is an evil. Another reason is uncertainty. Uncertainty in and of itself is not desirable. We prefer stability. We like to be able to predict our future. All right, so inflation kind of ruins that. What happens to the incentive for long-term investment if there's inflation, if you don't know what's going to be the prices in the near future? So that would go down, the level of investment. And also, people's level of confidence will be lower. So households and firms will have a lot of uncertainty in terms of future planning. And overall, that's going to reduce our well-being. Pause here. Are you allergic to math? I'm going to show you some shortcuts which will simplify your life. So this is the main formula for inflation rate. And sometimes you're given P1 and P2, you simply plug them in, you find the inflation rate. But sometimes you know the inflation rate and you know one of the p-values and you have to find the other one. Okay, so that's where you have to do cross multiply and a bit of manipulation. And some students are like, oh no, what's happening, right? So whenever the P1 is unknown, whenever you're asked to find P1, once you simplify things, this is the formula that you can use, all right? And whenever P2 is unknown, this is the formula that you use, okay? After this, basically I've done the simplification for you. The only thing to watch for is use the inflation rate in decimal. So if the inflation rate is 5%, you put 0.05, okay? So you can box those formulas. These are kind of like shortcuts, almost like cheating, right? They can help you save time. Let's look at a couple of examples. So in each of these two examples, you're given the inflation rate and you are given one of the p-values, P1 or P2, and you have to find the other p-value. So you have to decide which formula you use and then plug in the values and find it. So in each case, start by writing what you know and what you don't know. okay? And then which formula you use, and then plug it in and go with 2 decimal places. Wow, that was cool. Something related to inflation is a distinction between real versus nominal as applied to GDP. So sometimes GDP is measured in current dollars, where you have the dollar value of each year. The problem with that is what you have been told a long time ago, that you cannot add apples and oranges. What's going on? If you say 1 apple plus 1 orange, what is the answer? Right? You cannot really add them up unless you say, well, there are 2 fruits or 2 objects. But you cannot say there are 2 apples. You cannot say that there are 2 oranges. You must convert to the same currency. You need to have a common unit. All right. The same goes with whenever the prices are changing. $1 today plus $1 last year. What is that? You need to first have the same units. All right. So, wow, that's cool. I love this cartoon. Also, they should make one for Dollarama. Oh no. So this is effectively useless. It's useless because you cannot compare. You cannot add. Right? The solution is real GDP. Real GDP is really good. All right. Why? Because you have taken care of that. We are using constant dollars instead of current dollars by using a base year. The base year is arbitrary, but what's important is to be consistent. Always use the same base year. All right. And this would be unaffected by inflation, which makes us able to compare, and that would be meaningful. All right. So basically, nominal GDP can change because of either price or quantity, but we don't want that. We don't want the GDP values to be inflated by the price. Real GDP only reflects the actual production. It focuses only on the quantity, and that's why it's useful. We talked about 4 sectors which spend money, and that spending constitutes GDP, which is the same as national income. And when divided by the population, we get the standard of living. When the national income is low, we get unemployment, and when it's high, we get inflation. And I would emphasize the definitions of unemployment and inflation, and also the formulas that we had. Now, this is a simple diagram. When you do your own, I would suggest to try to add imports. Remember, you have to actually subtract imports, so see where you can fit that in. Also, think of labor force participation rate, GNP, purchasing power, and the real versus nominal. If you can add at least a couple of those things, it would really improve your learning. Add at least 2 concepts from today's lesson to your answers to the myth of the day. A suggested answer is that we can look at car prices compared to the quality and safety, as well as salaries compared to before COVID. The argument is that the standard of living is based on real GDP per capita. That's the determining factor. And we must see how much wages have changed compared to prices. When we say the price of something has gone up, we assume that it's the same thing, but it has often improved. And that is the limitation of GDP. Have a great day.